Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to What's New with the Domino Objects by Example. My name is James Cooper. I'm team lead and architect for the back-end classes, which we call for purposes of this presentation the Domino Objects, but nowhere else. Co-presenting with me today is Nathan Barry, who I'll introduce in a moment. So, we have a very short agenda today. And it actually looks like we didn't do anything this release. It couldn't be further from the truth. We'll be presenting Release 901 today with some background on Release 9 as well. 901, we picked up where we left off in Release 9. We had some additional things to do, and development cycle was incredibly short as development cycles go, but it was fully packed. It was very intense. And in fact, we did probably at least half of our development after code freeze. So it was a really busy time. And we'll be presenting today our last piece of our view navigation performance effort, at least last for the foreseeable future, on behalf of XPages. And we'll also present the new things and some of the older Release 9 things in calendaring and scheduling. Now, many of you know that the back-end classes developers are middlemen. Certainly the old hands do. We package up what the Domino server publishes in C API form in some very arcane methods, and we reproduce it for you in Lotus script and a set of Java classes, so to make your life easier. But some of these C packages, our calendaring and scheduling is one of the best examples I can think of, are incredibly difficult. And any of you folks, and some have, tried to reproduce our calendaring environment from our published schema, the data schema for our documents, you know exactly how hard this is, and it's actually beyond my ability to tell you what's going on. So I brought in Mr. Nathan Barry, who is the architect for our C API calendaring and scheduling package, and I have not seen him stopped on any question. So we'll both be in the lab all week. If we don't have time today, we have a lot of content here, but do stop by and ask us your worst, and we'll do what we can for you. With that, I'll turn it over to Nate, and we'll get underway.
All right, thanks, Jim. So as Jim said, I've worked on the C implementation of the Notes and Domino Calendar APIs. Here I'm going to focus mostly on the back-end implementation, which is a layer on top of it. But I will talk a little bit about the different layers that are available as well. The calendar APIs were introduced in 9.0. And much of what we're going to talk about today is review and background on that. But we will also focus on the new additions that went into 9.01. A lot of these new additions are things that were demanded by people that were using the API, such as probably some of yourselves, requests that have come in, some new capabilities and enhancements. What the APIs do, there's really two sets of things that it does. The first is a set of Icalendar-based CRUD operations, create, read, and update, using Icalendar as the data payload. As Jim said, anyone who's tried to use the traditional NSF APIs to create and work with calendar data has undoubtedly had some headaches. With repeating meetings especially, there can be n number of repeating meetings, of documents that correspond to a single repeating meeting. And I don't know how many different types of notices we send out now, but invitations, updates, reschedules, cancels, delegation notices, there's a few of those, counter proposals, requests for information, it goes on and on. And in order to develop against these, traditionally, you needed to not only know the relationship between all of the different notes that are involved in this, but you needed to understand all of the different properties on the notes. And a number of applications have cleverly, used our schema, done reverse engineering, figured it out, and wrote applications that worked only to find out that on X version or with X product or an X scenario, we were missing some property and it breaks. These APIs encapsulate that. So use of Icalendar means that you don't need to know about any of those properties. And that includes the outgoing notices. We have what we call implicit scheduling. If you create an entry on your calendar where you're the organizer, we'll send out the invitations. If you update it, we'll determine what types of notices need to be sent out and handle it automatically. So as he said, we did expand this in 901, and we'll be focusing on that today. Another thing is the REST calendar service. We'll cover a little bit later. Some of you may know about this. It was presented a little bit last year at Connect, but it wasn't available in 9.0. It has been out on OpenNTF, and it was part of Domino 901 out of the box. So we'll spend a little more time on that. The different levels of the calendar API that IBM offers are shown on the left here in the orange. And it all starts at the bottom with the core notes and domino logic. That's the part that's not exposed. This is what we've had for years. What we use internally to generate workflow, to deal with interoperability with Exchange, and to process calendar entries. Built on that is the CSDK. And this was our attempt to allow all of the operations you need to do in calendar, using the Icalendar input and using these actions and whatnot. And that's really where all the work is here as far as the calendar logic goes. On top of the CSDK, Jim and his team have implemented the backend classes, which is more than just a wrapper, a representation of the same methods. It actually reorganizes these because we have class objects into a much more logical way to work with data. And we'll focus on that more. Built upon those Java classes are two other higher level functions. JavaScript, server-side JavaScript for X pages development, and also the REST services. The REST services expose this over HTTP to allow yet another type of application to consume them. And those REST services, in addition to supporting iCal, also allow transformation into JSON. So certainly makes the parsing much easier. But that's really only half the story. On the left is the IBM API. But one of the benefits we get from using Icalendar as an open standard is that there's existing third-party applications out there that know how to deal with this. Maybe you have an application that you're working with that already generates Icalendar. If you don't, you can use things like iCal4j, which we're going to look at today, to construct the Icalendar, to parse it and interpret it, and it really makes your life a lot easier. And then in the middle is just a few of the types of applications that we think are good candidates to develop using these APIs. And I really think that we go up the stack. So any Domino applications you're going against, we believe you can use the calendar APIs we offer. So I just want to step back a bit and talk about what Icalendar is, because I think it's important to understand for the context of this. It's a text-based calendar representation of information, and it is the industry standard. You can view the details in RFC 5545, which isn't, it doesn't read like a book, but compared to some other RFCs, it's not that bad. You can see the example here is a pretty simplistic version. It starts and ends with begin vCalendar and end vCalendar, and within that is a collection of properties and components. This vCalendar stream has one property, the prod ID. This is a property we require, and it's essentially you as the Icalendar creator saying who you are. Among other things, it really helps with diagnostics down the road when we're trying to figure out what problems are with data or where data originated from. Beyond that, you see there's a single vEvent component, and within that, a number of other properties. So we have a DT start, DT end. These are just times when the calendar entry happens. UID is an identifier. How do I refer to this calendar entry? And there's other properties. Transparency, does this block my busy time? Summary, what is the subject of this? But there's a lot more in Icalendar. There's categories, there's alarms, there's time zones, you can specify recurrence patterns. And in fact, you can have multiple vEvents if you wanted to have exceptions to that pattern. So it occurs Monday through Friday at 9 o'clock, except Wednesdays at 10 with a different subject and location. And Icalendar supports all of that. The three classes that we want to talk about are the Notes Calendar class, the Notes Calendar Entry class, and the Notes Calendar Notice class. And these are how we grouped the functionality because it's really the most logical way. Notes Calendar is really equivalent to your mail file, your database. Every database that is a mail file has a calendar with it, and you can get a Notes Calendar from a database. On that calendar, there's any number of Notes Calendar entries. And an entry is really something on your calendar. If you create an appointment, it's a Notes Calendar entry. If you create a repeating meeting, it's a single Notes Calendar entry. A Notes Calendar notice is something that got delivered to you. It's an invitation that arrived in your inbox. It's an acceptance notice, a reschedule, a cancel, an update, and whatnot. And there's different operations that you can do based on a notice or an entry, and thus those are in two different classes. The first class we're going to focus on is the Notes Calendar one. Some of the things you can do that apply to your whole calendar are things like read the view level data. So I can get a feed of everything for this month, and it won't include the description or the attendees, but it'll include all the information I might need to display this in my view. And there's a whole bunch of different bells and switches that you can turn on to control the behavior of that. You can get a list of entries or a list of notices. So I can say, I want to get all the entries this month, and it will return a vector of Notes Calendar entry objects. Or I can say, I want to get all the invitations that I haven't processed, and return that back as a vector of Notes Calendar notices. Given every one of these has an identifier. An entry is identified by the UID, which is that Icalendar identifier. A notice is identified by a UNID or a Note ID, like a traditional document. So given one of these identifiers, you can get an object that corresponds to that. Create entry. This is one of the things we're going to focus on in the demo. But give Icalendar input, put it in my calendar, and make this event happen. We talked a little bit about implicit scheduling. When you do this, we'll send out the invitations for you. You don't have to worry about it. A couple things are new here in 901. First is Icalendar has a plain text description, but we now allow HTML content to be specified via proprietary tag, which we'll look at in a little bit. And also we improved the mapping between a UID and an appointment ID. And this is a little geeky and techy, but if you haven't run into the problem, you may not care, but it was certainly something that a number of implementers thought that every user should have that same mapping, and we agreed and implemented it. And there's another utility method off this class which really exposes that mapping that we have here to get the appointment ID from a UID. So I'm going to sit down and exit the slideshow for a minute and bring up the clips. And actually, before I do, I want to show you, I have the mail file up here for, this is Mr. Einstein. I switched it. I meant to be on Mr. Newton. And you can see that his calendar is empty for this week, other than I think there's a little test appointment down there. So we're going to use the APIs, and we're going to create an appointment. So first off here, you see I have the traditional session and database objects, which are all familiar. And also we're using Notes Calendar object, and at the end of the day, we're going to create a Notes Calendar entry. So to start out, I basically get a session and a database, and I'm getting my organizer Notes Calendar object from my organizer by calling session.getCalendar and passing in the database. And once I have that, I'm ready to create my Icalendar and pass it in. So this calendar object here is an Ical4j calendar object. And this is really just a little worker that allocates it and passes it back. I then create a bunch of strings for all the different properties I want to set. So start, end, summary, location, description, organizer, attendee, and recurrence rule. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass those strings into a little helper routine that uses Ical4j to construct the event. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because this isn't about Ical4j, but I did want to show how simple it is, that it really is just taking these strings, it's creating properties, and there's a different class for each one of the properties. So there's a DT start class, a DT ends class, and it's adding it to the array. Now in this case, I could probably have written a simple parser or constructed a string. But if I wanted to go and add parameters or other things to this stream, Ical4j makes that really, really simple. So as I return back to my higher level method here, I'm going to add that v event into my vCalendar stream, and the result is what output here in the console. You can see that I have a Icalendar stream that looks very much like the example I showed in the slides. So this is the magic. All of that was before it really gets into our code, and now we're going to say create entry, and I'm just going to pass that string in, and that's it. So if I go to my calendar and refresh it, the meeting is there for the week. The properties are all set correctly, and in fact, the invitee just got an invitation sent to him as well. Also, you notice here that when I called that, there was logging that showed up in the console. Enter cal create entry, exit cal create entry. What you'll find is this logging came from the C code, the lower level implementation, and it essentially tracks the entrance and exit points of every method with the arguments that go in, and also will output any sort of interesting information. In this case, it's not overly interesting. If you're running into problems and you're trying to figure out why is it not liking my iCalendar, if you look at this, a lot of times it'll be like, your prod, you don't have a prod ID in your iCalendar. And it's like, oh, I remember Nate said that. I'll go add it in now. To add that, it's a notes INI parameter. CS debug API equals 1. And that parameter will turn on this logging. I wouldn't run it in production because it's a lot of I/O if you have a lot of load coming through, but it's really good for developing. In any event, I'm going to let this run, but the last thing I want to call out is that the return from the create entry was a notes calendar entry object. So with this object, I can now go and do other things with that entry. Now my application ended, but when I start the next one, I'm going to grab this UID that was created, and I'm going to paste it in, and we can modify this thing. In this case, the UID was generated because I didn't provide one. Normally, you could pass one in, and it would certainly be honored. So let's go back to my presentation. I want to talk about the notes calendar entry class a little bit. So certainly you can read it as iCalendar. You can update it, and we're going to show both of these things in the demo in a second. Updating, very much like create, does allow implicit scheduling. And this is a lot more important for the update method, because an update may invite new attendees. It may remove attendees. It may add rooms. It may remove rooms. It might send reschedules. It might send information updates. It might cancel occurrences. So all those things are handled automatically. New in 901 again, update also handles the HTML description. And the next two bullets here are about recurring meetings. In 9.0, the APIs, although they allowed you to create repeating meetings, really only allowed you to modify one occurrence at a time. And there are reasons why there's some things that were tricky with how do we want to allow series updates and whatnot. We've tried to tackle those here. So for meetings, we allow you to update the series so long as you don't change the actual recurrence pattern, so non-time changes for the series. And we allow you to make any changes you want to an appointment. So you can change the time to an appointment or the information. If anyone wants to know why we don't allow changing the time to a series, it's a conversation for the lab probably, because I don't want to run out of time here. The other thing is smart sequence. iCalendar and Notes both have the concept of sequencing in Calendar. So an invitation comes with sequence 0, a reschedule comes with sequence of 1. Then an information update doesn't always increment the sequence, or doesn't. A reschedule does. When you start dealing with workflow across instances, it becomes a little more complicated and harder to figure out what you're supposed to pass in. Now you don't have to deal with that. You can pass in the smart sequence flag, and we'll kind of say, all right, we're going to treat what you gave us as up to date, and we're going to handle all the sequencing appropriately. Also, it takes action on a calendar entry without Icalendar. So these are things like, given that UID, I want to decline it. I want that thing off my calendar. I want to cancel it, delete, delegate, counter, accept, tentatively accept. All of the actions that you can get in Notes, you can get through the API. There was some feedback from 9.0 that one thing that, gee, wouldn't it be nice to be able to do is I just want to add invitees to this, and I don't want to change anything else. I don't want to have to read it out as Icalendar and figure out how to update it and pass that in. I just want to say, put Frank on my meeting. So we added that capabilities to add and remove invitees without any Icalendar. Another capability is to open it as a document. Now, in a single meeting, it's pretty straightforward. There's one document, we can open it up. In a repeating meeting, there's a number of documents, potentially, that represent that series, and there's some flags that we have to control to make sure you get the document you want. One thing we lacked in 9.0, and we had a good amount of feedback on, was we didn't allow you to get the parent document. And I was given a little grief for that, and part of the reason was there's not a lot of reasons you want to open it, and we didn't trust our app dev people to know that they weren't really modifying things when they weren't. But if you pass in this flag, you're essentially saying, yeah, give me the parent. I know what I'm doing. And there's actually a lot of uses where people, it turns out, do want to open that note. And the last thing is getting unprocessed notices. I have an event on my calendar. I don't know, are there reschedules to it? Are there updates? Has it been canceled? How do I find that out? This will return a vector of notices that you can then iterate through and process. So with that, I'm going to break into the next demo. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this UID that we just created, because I'm going to modify this entry, and I'm going to paste it in here. And what you'll see is that as we get here, I can, get my organizer cal object in the same way as before. I can call get entry, pass in that UID, and it will give me an object. So now I have my notes calendar entry object for the event we just created. Here I'm again getting an Icalendar for J representation of that object. I'm calling entry.read. So this is passing that Icalendar in, and I'm turning it into an Icalendar for J structure. Here I have a loop. What I want to do with this first case is I really want to update the series. So if you have a repeating meeting that has exceptions, reading it as Icalendar may result in more than one V event. There may be the V event for the recurrence pattern and another one for Wednesday. So I have some code here that's stripping out the ones I don't care about and just leaving me with the recurrence pattern itself. And this then allows me to make a modification to it. In this case, I'm just going to set the location. I'm going to say this is happening at the fountain in the Swan. So again, all that was just to create my iCal, one call into the APIs, into the update method, and I'm passing in my smart sequence flag, and I'm passing in another new flag, guarantee no reschedule. The history behind this one is a little harder to explain, but essentially it's saying, I'm passing you a recurrence rule, I'm not changing the time, let this pass. We would normally, if the recurrence rule was identical, honor that anyway, but this allows for applications to potentially modify a recurrence rule, because there are patterns that equate to the same thing, even though they're different. So in any event, we pass that in, even though it's unnecessary here. And when I go into my calendar and I hit refresh, you'll see that the location is at the Rotunda lobby, and it's going to switch now to the fountain at the Swan. Now I'm going to change the description of Monday, and this is where I'm going to use the new HTML content that's added in 9.01. So, and pretty much similar to before, I'm going to first read the entry, and I'm going to read just Monday's occurrence by passing in Monday's time. And then I'm going to add a property to that with the name of xAltDesk. This is actually a property that, because it starts with X, it means it's not part of the standard. It's a proprietary property. Normally, proprietary properties are X-Lotus-something, or X-Microsoft, or X-Apple. This one was actually first used by Microsoft, and they documented it. And we thought it was easier for our app dev community to reuse the same property that they might already have with other applications. So we're repurposing it within our software. So that if you populate it, and in this case, and my HTML isn't really very exciting, but I have some bold text here. I'm going to update it. I'm going to pass in the smart sequence flag, and I'm going to change the description. And when I open up the Monday occurrence, you can see my bold text shows there. All right, so here's let's go into the next thing that we want to change. This one isn't that exciting. We're just going to read the entry in the same way that we did before. I'm going to get the start and end properties, and I'm going to offset them by an hour. And I'm going to again call the update method, and again I'm going to pass in smart sequence. And when I go back into notes and refresh, Tuesday just moved it to an hour later. Again, because I passed in smart sequence, it not only did it know that I was changing the time, but it also sent a reschedule, whereas the first one sent an information update, and that all happens automatically. And the last example for update here is only one line. I'm going to cancel Thursday and Friday, and it's really as simple as that. Entry.cancel, I'm adding some comments to tell people why I'm canceling. I want to cancel this in future, and I pass in Thursday's date. So I will now let this run. I'm going to go back into my calendar and refresh. Thursday and Friday are gone. So now I'm going to actually switch back over to Mr. Einstein here, the invitee. And when I look at his calendar, you can see it is populated with notes, calendar, notices. There's the broadcast invitation we just sent, an information update for the series, one for the description, a reschedule because the smart sequence flag detected that it was a time change, and the cancellation as well. So that segues us into talking about notes, calendar, notice. So similar to an entry, a notes, calendar, notice, you can read it as Icalendar. There are no create or modify options with the notice because what you do with the notice is some concrete action. You don't edit it, you accept it, you decline it, you counter it, you delegate it, and those are the operations you can do on a notice. Like an entry, you can also get it as a document. There aren't any changes here in 901 because most of this is pretty straightforward. The other one thing I want to call out is that you can get an unaccepted invitation that applies to a notice. And this is probably an edge use case, but if you are iterating through documents in your inbox and you find a reschedule and you want to accept the meeting before you accept the reschedule, you can go and get that invite. That's what that last capability is. So as we step in here to the last of the demos, what I'm going to do is, for this invitee now, I'm going to go through and I'm going to process all of these. So if I open up his calendar, you can see that the invitation and the reschedule are ghosted there, but they are not processed yet. So as I run it, same as before, I get the notes calendar object, and I'm now doing a call to get new invitations. And if I look at that vector that's returned, there's only one object. In this case, it's the invite that we just sent. So I can iterate through that one invite, and I can accept it. And just like that, the meeting is now accepted. Now, we know that this isn't up to date. There was an information update on this one. This one was rescheduled. The last two are canceled. We need to process the rest of these outstanding notices for it. So that's where I can now do that. And actually, with the way this code is written, it's doing it for everything in the month. So I've now accepted all my invitations. I'm now going to get all of the calendar entries on my calendar for this month. And I pass in the start and end time, and if you look at the entries, there's 12 of them. So there's more than just this one that we're dealing with. But that's okay. We're gonna process all of them. So let me run this thing. So what I did was I called entry.getNotices, and this happens to be the only one that has outstanding notices. So I now know that we're in the meeting that we were just dealing with. And I'm going to walk through it a little bit. And now that I have my notes calendar notice, I'm going to call the getIsDocument method. Once I have a document, I can use traditional NSF-like APIs. And in this case, I want to read the notice type. And why do I want to do that? Because I'm not sure if this is a removal or a cancel, because in that case I want to call the remove canceled method, or if it's a reschedule or an information update or something that I want to call the accept method for. Turns out there's really only those two different things that I need to call in this application, so I'm going to let it run, and I found one that I need to accept. I found another that I need to accept, and one that I need to remove the cancel on. Okay. And it seems to think everything is up to date, so now let's go back to my calendar. I refresh it, and there we are. And if I look at this instance, you'll see that it in fact has the text there and the new location, and everything is happy. So I think that's the demo that I wanted to show. Before I pass it back to Jim, I just want to call out that there's a slide for each of the new methods we added. We've already talked about these: get appointment ID from UID, add invitees, remove invitees, modify invitees, the new flags for update, and the new flag for getIsDocument. So these are here for reference. That has all the arguments listed out, and you can look in the slides after for that. So now I'll pass it back to you, Jim.
Me?
Hey, you're on yours.
Right. Okay. So no sooner did we ship release 9, we had the good core of our calendaring and scheduling editing package in place. We turned our thoughts to making a product out of this. And what would it take? And right off the bat, we realized we needed two big pieces. If you have a calendar, what good is a calendar without meetings? So given you're going to have meetings on your calendar, and presumably those meetings will take place in conference rooms and such hotspots in the case of IBM. So you have to schedule these things. And in order to schedule them, you really need to know that they exist. So we built a method that is sort of an aside to the CNS API. It does a lot of paddling under the surface, much as a duck would, to gather information and coalesce it into a compact information stream. So free resource search will look up resources. If you give it a date and a time for the meeting that you want, and a type, and a site string, for instance, IBM Littleton. Type could be any of two constants, type room, as in a conference room, or any of the other things that CNS might track, like resources, projectors, picture screens. If you call this method, we'll produce an output set for you. Realizing, looking downstream, that we may have need to present more information as time goes on. Domino is always changing. We put a type constant on the output format. So you can use this type constant. And here's what you get on the default version, which is the first published format. In Java, you'll get a vector of strings. It's a little unusual. Each entry is a composite string. So we call this in Domino a string of strings. So you have the resource name separated by a semicolon to the room capacity, another semicolon, and the email address of the room so that you can book it. Same thing for Lotus script. you have an array of strings, and each of those strings is a string of strings. The other thing that is done is if you're an executive or some sort of a bigwig in your company, you want to hand off your mail file duties to your assistant. So we produced a new method on Admin P to accomplish mail file delegation. So all you really need to know for this is the mail file owner. It does ask for a mail file name and mail server. You can call another back-end method to get those called getMailInfo, and that will again run around, look at various directories and gather that information for you. You can drop it into this method along with a vector containing access rights of who you want to be able to read your mail file or to write your mail file or do any of the other things you could do with a mail file. Now, I mentioned that we continued our work on the View Navigator, and we've got the last feature in place now for 9.01 release. To be truthful, we tried to ship this in release 9. We didn't make it. We ran right through the end of release 9. At the last minute, we found some problems with X pages, and we had to pull it back. So we got to work, and now it's finished. To recount what we've done in the last several years, while we've been testing and retesting and testing again Xpage's performance, we need to support as many users as we can per server. So the back end was never designed to support a client display. This back end was 20 years old, and the vision for it at that time was all agent background processing. But Xpages is really different. It is a real-time client substitute, principally over the net in a browser, but even on a client machine. So in 8.5.2, we changed the focus of our View Navigators to rebuild them for performance. In the old days, they read each view one entry at a time. This was ultimately flexible. You could do anything you liked with it, but it wasn't particularly fast. In 8.5.2, we introduced a cache. You can tell us how many records you're interested to get at a time. We'll read it in one gulp from the server, and you'll be much faster. 8.5.3, we added a method to tell us what kind of guidance you'd like us to have when we're filling our cache. So you pass us a method ID and constant, and we'll say, oh, he's only interested in categories today, so we'll disregard all the child data for that. And again, we solved another class of problems in Xpage's display performance. We had one persistent display problem. This was a big one. Some of our customers hit it, opened up some very heavyweight PMRs, and we solved it with a cache improvement, which we call auto expand guidance. We've actually been working on this for about 2.5 years. It was a really big piece. Took a lot of work in the back end, a lot of work in NSF and NIF underneath us, the C APIs for Domino. The actual core of Domino had to change to do this. So this gives you explicit high-speed control over exactly what view entries get expanded or collapsed. And to do this, we accept two lists, an expand list and a collapse list. Each list contains node IDs of the documents or view entries that you want to have expanded. We had to further enhance the back end because categories in a categorized view are one of the things that you would want to expand. And lo and behold, they had no node IDs. If you ask a view entry, which is a category, what its node ID is, we would say nothing. We'd give you an empty string. This is a little diagram of that. So as we ship the product, you ask each entry its node ID. You get the document ID for child entries, but for categories, you get an empty string. But if you set this property on view to true to enable node IDs for categories, we'll make up a node ID. In fact, categories don't exist at all. They're a fabrication of the view that Domino sort of cobbles together for your convenience and for display. But there's nothing behind it. It's just a concept. If you set this property, we'll make one up, and we'll return it to you as a string, but it doesn't look like any other node ID you've ever seen. The high bit is always set. And so it's a little odd, but they're easy to pick out, so that's good. Now here's an example auto-expand guidance. Here's a simple categorized view with 3 categories and some child documents in each category. And we're going to employ an expand list of a single node ID in this case. In this example for category 2. And then we're going to pass that to our auto-expand guidance method. Just pass in that expand list. We will not include a collapse list for this example. Now, doing that alone isn't very interesting because as you create a view navigator and you enumerate it, all these entries are going to be expanded by default, even if you pass in an expand list. But if we set max level to 0, the maximum level is a property on the view navigator. And we say we're only interested in level 0. We don't see any children at all. But now we've introduced the concept of an expand list. And if our expand list contains a category 2 node ID, what you get is the collapsed categories for category 1 and 3. The category 2 will be expanded according to the expand list, which gives us license to violate the maximum level limit. Now, for a collapse list, it's a similar situation, but sort of the reverse. The same categorized view. Here we set the max level to 1. So we display both, by default, both category 1 and the first level child documents. But if we send in that category 2 node ID to a collapse list, and we include the collapse list but no expand list, and then we enumerate the navigator, what we get is category 1 and 3 both expanded, but category 2 will be collapsed according to the collapse list guidance. Now, it is not obvious right off the top of your head probably what good this is to you, but it is of extreme goodness to X pages, and I'll show you why in a moment. I just want to mention in passing, this is a cache feature, and in order to make the cache work at all, you have to give the backend a performance instruction, set auto update to false, which gives us license to ignore dirty collection signals from the core. On a busy view, the core is always sending us the view is dirty, the view is dirty. If this property is set by true, which it is by default, we're obliged to restart our navigation, relocate the last point of reference, and continue. But it is possible to design views so these dirty collections really don't matter at all, and these are the views that we're interested in for performance. So we have 2 forms of this method. Both take the cache size as the first entry just for convenience. So it's prudent to set your cache size to match exactly what you're doing. If you want to display a 30-line screen, just set it to 30. And we'll look ahead 30. Very likely, if you're just enumerating what we have found, then every succeeding navigation will be a hit on the cache. We will never go back to the server, and your performance will be very nice. Now, the other entries, the collapse list and expand list itself can take two forms. One is a notes note collection in this override, and in this override, an integer array of node IDs. And it's a fair question to ask, well, where do I get these node IDs? The sky is the limit here. We have lots and lots of ways. It really depends on what kind of application you might have in mind. And I'll show you some examples coming up. One way to get them is to look for them using a getAllDocumentsByKey method. This will return a collection of documents, document collection. And you can just make a single call to that document collection, get node IDs, and get your array of node IDs. You can enumerate a view navigator with a particular maximum level set. So you might just pull out the categories and you say, I want these all expanded or I want these all collapsed for whatever reason. You could track individual documents based on UI interactions, input from the keyboard. This is what XPages will be doing, and I'll show you that in a moment. We can search for them using full text search, or you could do a formula evaluation within a note collection. And the result of that formula will produce a note collection that you can stick right into a method call. Or you might have a number of document collections lying around with some significance to you. You might want to subtract one collection from another using a logical operator or a view entry collection. You could add them together, subtract them, do whatever. And come up with a resulting list of node IDs that you might want to use as an expand or a collapse list. So I put together a few examples of using auto-expand guidance. And here's a discussion database put together by my cat. You'll see that, let's see, this is the database. And my Siamese is into everything, so you'll see he has done all the posting. This is what happens when you have a Siamese in the house. They have 4 hands instead of 2. And he posts about topics of his interest, which are other critters, dogs, birds, whatever. Let's see here. I've temporarily lost track of my Okay, so here's what the demo is going to do. Rather than show you code, I thought I would just go through it. First, we'll get the view, the current view. We'll create a view navigator. We'll turn off auto updates because we don't care about dirty collections. We'll put up a search string dialog using Java Swing classes. We'll take an input string to search for. We'll do a full text search on the database. We'll pull out all the targets for that string. And then we'll get a view entry collection. And we'll just rip through that view entry collection doing get next and ask each of the entries for its node ID. We'll put those into an array, and then we'll use that array as an expand list to call expand collapse guidance. Then we'll enumerate the view navigator using that cache, the cache that we get from the expand list. So let's go in here and start creating some things. We can, off the bat, search for dog. Now this is the result list we got back from dog, and we see that all the dog entries are expanded in red here. This corresponds to exactly what we have here. And I just want to point one thing out. So we can search for turtle. I didn't do this on purpose, but I was rehearsing this morning, and I see my cat has entered, my turtle has fleas, and she sure does scratch a lot. And I thought, how bad is that to be a turtle with an itch? Doesn't get any worse. Right, not planned, sorry. I'd like to say it was. Back to the presentation, let's see. Now, as I mentioned, our target was X pages. We wanted to make it better. So I'm going to get right in and show you an X page, what we can do with that. This is basically how an X page would use this feature, and does use this feature. I'm talking to a server that I'm running in the box here. So this is just a demo database that I got from the XPages boys. So as we go through this database, it's got triply categorized views. And as the person navigates this view, he pushes twisties. Well, that AAA category, node ID, goes into an expand list, which the XPage app runtime tracks for your whole session. And as the user is, based on a whim, says, I'm not interested in beans today, that collapses, and that entry goes into the collapsed list for this XPage app. So every time the user returns to this app, XPages stores these as just Java arrays. It can restore them in an ongoing manner. So you can see how these lists might build up, ad nauseum. It's a lot of lists here. It's a very clever code. There's a lot going on. Now, the other thing you can do with an X page is the actual reason for the expand collapse list itself, which is the notorious by tags view. Now, this database that I'm looking at here contains hundreds of thousands of documents. This is our torture test. And I don't know what my server is doing here. All right, so these are several categories. Between each category are tens of thousands of documents. And, on the order of 20 or 30,000 documents typically. So I'm going to push this button, ready, set, go, push. And this is as XPages ships, even in 901. The default is using the standard navigation from past releases. And you can see on a busy server, this often times out. We just don't have enough cycles to do all the computation that we need to get this thing on the screen. But if we go to the enhanced navigation techniques based on the expand collapse list, this is a new version of XPages runtime, which you can switch on by setting certain properties within the XPage environment. We can do the exact same test 1, 2, 3, push. And we see it takes about 1.5 seconds to do that same 11 to 12 second operation. We wish it were 1/4 second. It's not yet. But just to let you know what Xpages is doing and what the back end is doing with all this time, this 1.5 seconds of W530 laptop 8-way time, CPU time, it's computing this tab rack. Xpages maintains your expand collapse history for everything you have ever touched, looked at, expanded, and collapsed, and computes a very precise navigation tab for each one of these. This is extremely compute intensive. We actually begged them not to do this, but they felt they had to compete in the web world because this is what Google does and such things. You'll notice that in the Notes client, you can't do anything like this. The Notes client knows better. It would never attempt such a foolish thing. So all you get is a slide bar, and you pull it halfway, and who knows where you end up, somewhere. So I do recommend you all enable this new guidance feature wherever you can. Your Xpages will be a lot happier for it. The reason why we didn't is because it's a slight, minuscule behavioral difference, and we never like to pull a fast one on the customers and change our behavior. Now, the behavior is exactly this. In a multiply categorized view, a document could appear in more than one category, and if you feed a document ID, a node ID, into an expand or collapse list, if you expand one, if that document is elsewhere on the screen, that's going to expand as well. Now, this has been going on for 20 years in the client. Nobody has really complained very much about it, and we don't consider it a showstopper. So if you can possibly put up with that, do put up with it. So this feature can be enabled for all Xpages apps on your server at once, or it can be enabled per application, as I've done here, or even within an application, you can have a specific page show with the new Navigator or not. Let's see. So to enable for the entire application as a properties file in the root directory, data properties, subdirectories, and the file is called xsp.properties. Now this file doesn't exist as shipped, but we have a sample file, xsp.properties.sample, that is in that same place. And what you do is simply copy off that sample file into the xsp.properties file and change this property. xsp.domino.view.navigator equals by position. This is the default, sorry. Change it to by node ID, which is what the expand list contains. So it's navigation by node ID. Let's see. I think we've got to stop. It's 3:14.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't want to run into the next presentation. We have one more demo. It's a short one that Nate can show you in the lab, having to do with the REST service based on our calendaring and scheduling. And I do recommend you drop by and see us. Thank you for coming. Please fill out your evaluation sheets.